Hello, I'm Peg DeSanto, and I'm going to be talking to you about the vented hive versus the condensing hive and an intro to the hive hugger insulation system we developed, which did win the American Beekeeping Federation Award for Innovation last year. I have been a registered nurse for 37 years, a beekeeper for 6. But it is my years as a nurse that did lay the foundation for why I'm here talking about beehive insulation. I have worked in the ICU, emergency room, chemotherapy, and as a result, I have been intimately involved with hundreds of people as they fought for their lives. Maybe it looked like me doing chest compressions on them or giving chemotherapy to a 4-year-old. And it's changed me. In the core of my being, I know how precious life is, not just human life, all life. And so imagine how I felt that first year as a new beekeeper in Minnesota when I opened some of my hives and found tens of thousands of dead bees. I cried. I felt gut punched. Their deaths were on me, and I was hardwired to save lives. So in the subsequent years, I tried multiple different winterization systems. These are not my hives, but they sure could be because I tried many of these techniques, including straw bales. What strikes me most as I look at these photos is we beekeepers will go through great lengths to try to protect our bees in the winter. And we struggle with just how best to do this. So despite trying a lot of different winterization techniques, I continue to lose about half of my hives every winter. And I learned I was not alone. According to the University of Minnesota, 50 to 6% winter colony loss is the average in northern climates. But something inside me said, can't we do better by our bees? Well, as serendipity would have it, around this time, I started dating a man who owns a business in high-tech insulation. So together we paired up to develop the most effective winterization system ever made. I mentioned I was a nurse in the ICU, but I was also the instructor, where I would teach nurses how to care for these critically ill, complex patients. And everything we do in medicine to save lives is based in science. So as we started on this quest to save honeybee lives, it was also important that it was based in science. So given that, my first stop was sort of the world-famous University of Minnesota Bee Lab. When I asked for advice on where to get started on this quest, they said, look at the research done by Bill Heschbeck. Bill is kind of the godfather of condensing hives. He wrote an article in Winter Management on that topic. So I had reached out to Bill. He's become a friend and a mentor of mine, has used the product for 3 years in a row now, gives it 2 thumbs up. But besides Bill, I really did a deep dive into the scientific research done on overwintering bees in general. And I was impressed. It's plentiful, it's consistent, it's current, and frankly, the research has gotten very high tech. For example, we have access to information we didn't have years ago. Infrared thermal imaging. It can kind of take a peek inside your beehive and tell you, are there areas of heat loss? Where's the cluster? How big is it? And then there's a whole world of sensors. These little green rectangles can give you the temperature and relative humidity inside your hive every 10 minutes. One particular researcher that I want to call out is Etienne Tardif in the Yukon. He's a beekeeper, engineer, researcher, and speaker on overwintering bees. What Etienne will do is he'll put in 20 sensors in a single hive and then repeat this for multiple hives and just switch out the winterization approach. Insulate, not insulate, ventilate, even change the size of the ventilation hole. And as a result, year after year, he's gotten millions of data points. This is a cross section of one of his hives. Basically, you can see like every inch, he can tell you the temperature and relative humidity of that part of the beehive, where there's ventilation channels, where the cluster is. And so the point being, based on this high-tech research, it's no longer a mystery what's going on inside our beehives in the winter thermodynamically. Like the data's out there that says this is sort of the optimal way of overwintering. So what we did is we basically built a winterization system based on what science says we should do. But before I go into that, the science behind the design, I do want to be the first to say that of that 50 to 60% colony loss, only a portion of that is from cold exposure or perhaps inadequate control of moisture. But we thought, if we could just put a dent in that portion, it was worth a try. So the biggest, and excuse my pun, heated debate when looking into the research that I came across was, what is the bigger cause of winter mortality for our bees? Is it the moisture, wet bees, or is it the cold? And if I took a survey, my guess is there'd be a 50-50 split amongst beekeepers. And from what I've learned, you would all be right. It's both. And we need to solve for both. Well, how to solve for both? I feel like the thermodynamics of that are best explained by giving a relatable life example. Let's all say we're going to go on a road trip to the Yukon in January. It's a very long drive, so we pile in the bus and we have a lot of hours to talk about beekeeping. As a result, there's a lot of hot air in the bus. Pretty soon, condensation starts to collect on the windows. It's so thick, like the bus driver can't see outside anymore. Side question, what is the temperature of the windows for condensation to be collecting? Well, the answer is dew point, and it's a really important term to remember for later. As we're like all sitting here digesting our last meal, a byproduct of our metabolism is actually water vapor. And when that water vapor hits a surface in the room, like it might be a can of pop, when that water vapor hits a surface cold enough to be at the dew point, that water vapor turns into liquid water, and thus condensation forms. So back to the bus. What do we do about this condensation? Well, we ventilate, right? The bus driver turns on the vent. Does he bring in fresh air or recycled? Fresh air. We crack our windows. Pretty soon that warm, moist air gets replaced by cold, dry air. But now what's happening in the bus, right? It's getting cold. The condensation's cleared up, but now it's getting pretty cold in the bus. So now let's bring this inside a beehive. Like humans, a byproduct of the bee's metabolism is also water vapor. According to Randy Oliver, for every pound of honey the bees consume, they will produce 1¼ cups of water. And a certain percentage of that water is actually in water vapor. So, like on the bus, as that exhaled water vapor starts to hit a surface in the beehive that's at the dew point, and that water vapor turns into liquid water, if that's on the ceiling of the hive, that water is going to drip down on our bees. And we know wet bees are dead bees. So what do a lot of beekeepers do to solve for this moisture problem? Well, like on the bus, they ventilate. They might drill holes in the upper hive boxes or put on a quilt box with holes in it. But according to Derek Mitchell, he actually has his PhD in thermofluids at Leeds University. This diagram was taken from an article he published in the American Bee Journal. And what he explains is that when we put in upper entrances, cold air gets brought in through the lower entrance, and it's called this chimney or stacking effect, that it pushes up and out the warm, moist air. So we get a constant and continual flow of heat loss out that upper entrance. Well, is that a problem? I guess on the bus, cracking our windows isn't a big deal because we have a gas-powered engine. We can just crank the heat. But in a beehive, the bees are the gas, right? What do they do to generate heat? Well, first, queen goes in the middle, then they form a cluster and they start vibrating their wing muscles to generate heat. Here's a thermographic image of a heater bee. But according to the research, the heater bees can literally work themselves to death. It's called metabolic stress leads to metabolic death. Bill Heschbeck says, in non-insulated, ventilated hives, the bees have to put forth an extraordinary amount of effort to keep the colony alive all winter. And they will pay for it by dying earlier in the spring. Derek Mitchell's research goes on to say that the cluster is actually a survival mechanism we beekeepers impose upon our bees by not providing them enough thermal support. Etienne backs this up by saying in the Yukon, well-insulated, non-ventilated hives, the bees' resting metabolism is enough to maintain their entire internal environment, which means bees just living life as bees, the heat they put off, just their basic metabolism is enough to keep the colony alive. They don't go into this clustering, shivering response. In fact, this is a photo from Etienne's winter bees. You see them all sort of loosey-goosey roaming around the hive. So very important implications that came out of this research. Another research study, this was done in Australia, and what they look like, I will orient you to the graph. The lower axis is actually the temperature in the hive. This upper axis, the vertical axis, is metabolic rate, like how hard is the bee working. So I converted Celsius to Fahrenheit and gave you some temperatures here, but I want to bring your attention to this point where the axis splits. When we start getting temperatures less than 60, the metabolic rate of the honeybee goes up exponentially. I mean, this is only 60 to 50 degrees. Imagine 10 degrees or minus 10 degrees. Huge output in metabolic rate. Contrast that to the metabolic rate warmer than 60 degrees. Here's 60 to 86. Yeah, there's a mild increase in metabolic rate, but very minimal. And so the implications of this is once we start going less than 60 degrees, Etienne's research says it's actually around 50 to 55 degrees, the bees start to cluster and vibrate their wing muscles to generate heat. But because of this high metabolic demand comes increased honey consumption because they need honey for the energy to work this hard. Contrast that to when your bees are hanging out warmer than 60 degrees, very little metabolic demand and thus low honey consumption. So remember this 60 degrees for later. I will weave it back into some future research that I share. So other detrimental effects of cold/ventilating our bees. Again, 50 to 55 degrees, they start to cluster. Etienne's research says at about 14 degrees, the bees cluster can't get any tighter. And so if that cold threat persists and they can't do anything more about it, that outer layer of bees will go into chill coma, drop off the cluster until you have just a pile of dead bees. Or another way that they freeze to death is that cluster is so tight, it can't even move an inch away from its honey. And so a lot of beekeepers open their colony in the spring and find this ball of dead bees an inch away from honey, and they're like, oh, they starved to death. No, they froze to death because they were too cold. That cluster was too tight to even move to get to the honey. What starving to death looks like, however, is that the bees are able to mobilize around the colony in the winter, but because they're cold and consuming so much honey for heat, for energy for heat, they'll consume all the winter stores you left them and then starve to death. And another negative implication of that increased honey consumption from being cold is increased water consumption. And then with potentially limited opportunities for cleansing flights, they risk dysentery and spreading nosema. So just a negative cascade of ill effects from your bees being too cold in the winter. Another research study that was just put out in Bee Culture this year, and it was done by the USDA. And what this research showed is actually that cold bees have weaker immune systems, that the increased energy that the overwintering bee needs to maintain their hive temperature robs them from the energy for immune function. So cold bees are sicker and they're going to die quicker. And so, yeah, the bees in poorly insulated hives maybe can make it through winter, but at what cost? Another negative effect of having too cold of bees actually happens in the spring. And the spring is the most highest rate of mortality of any season. So it's very confusing and frustrating for bees. And the reason for this is that in the spring, the queen starts laying eggs, and these old, tired, especially tired if they've been cold, stressed winter bees now have to activate their glands to take care of baby bees and then heat the brood nest to 95 degrees. And if there's a cold snap and they just can't maintain that temperature, the brood will perish, and without replacement brood, this colony is in trouble. So I'll briefly orient you to what this sort of looks like. Remember those green sensors, those little rectangles? This is the data that comes from those. Here's the date. This is the temperature inside the hive. This blue slash line is actually outside ambient temperature. And each of these individual squiggly lines is a separate hive, the temperature in that unique hive. And let's just look at the end of February. You know, the hive's temperature is kind of all over the place. But around March 11th, you can see that at least 3 or 4 hives committed to raising brood. And once they do, no matter what the temperature, here it's 10 degrees out, they will do their darndest and work extremely hard to maintain that brood temperature zone. And like I said, if a cold snap happens and they can't do this, the brood is in trouble, and so is the whole colony. So what's needed of them thermodynamically in the middle of winter is very different demand metabolically than what's required of the bees once there's brood present. So if you winterize or if you insulate, don't be in a big rush to take it off in the spring. Very vulnerable time for your colony. The last negative effect of ventilating and frankly using a lot of moisture absorbing materials in your hive is the risk for life-threatening dehydration. Your bees need water to consume honey and to remain hydrated. There's reports of bees desperately flying out of the colony to bring back water. So yes, the research shows venting does get rid of moisture, but in doing so, it actually hurts our bees because it gets rid of precious water and leads to life-threatening cold exposure. And it looks like the bees agree. There's lots of reports of them propylizing up the upper entrances. This is an apame hive, the vents on that. So venting does not solve for both. So the common question asked now, well, if we aren't venting our hives, how do we get rid of the moisture in the hive, right? The wet bees are dead bees. Well, the answer is we insulate, but in a very specific way. The key is you super insulate the top of the hive, ensuring that it stays above dew point. You also insulate the side walls, but not as much, so that when condensation does occur in the hive, because it will, because we want it to, it will occur on the cooler walls. And remember, in a well-insulated hive, the bees aren't clustered at all, so they're free to roam around, go to the sidewalls, and drink the condensation that's collecting there. So again, remember dew point. Keep the top of the hive warm enough so it never reaches dew point, so the moisture does not condense there. Keeping your bees dry and warm. So the key to solving for both is a condensing hive. This is a nice research study done by John Gott. He's out east. And what he did is he top insulated some hives and not others. And then later, like opened up the hives and took a photo of this plexiglass inner cover. And the hives with good top insulation showed very little condensation just around the periphery, in contrast to the hives without top insulation, full of condensation. This is a short video just showing this phenomenon.
This bee is drinking some of the condensate from the edge of this hive, which is probably a water bottle bee. These bees will store the water and use it as needed in a cluster, probably mostly to thin the honey, so it can be consumed by the other bees. This is a clear inner cover without a vent. Two temperature sensors in here. One's measuring both the temperature and the humidity, and the other's just the temperature.
Okay. This next video is a short excerpt from a talk Randy Oliver gave, and this is what he has to say about the topic. Many of you know Randy Oliver with scientific beekeeping, really a world famous researcher on many, many topics.
Yes, go ahead. Randy, you made the comment that top entrances might not have value.
Yeah.
Why would you say that?
Because looking at all the research, there's very few places in the world where there's been any findings that suggest they actually do have a value. When you put a top entrance and a bottom entrance in, that's like imagine you live in a 2-story house during winter. Don't take my word for this. Try this, okay? Is it cold at your area now?
Yes.
Okay, so turn off the heater, open the front door, and open the top window, and see how it feels living in that house.
What about the moisture content? How's the condensation getting out of the hive?
So there's no reason for condensation if the hive is insulated enough. So generally, top insulation will put the condensation to the outside of the hive, to the where it reaches dew point temperature. That's the moisture the bees need in order to have enough moisture during the winter.
Okay. I figured if Randy Oliver said it, you'd probably believe him more than just me. And so he summed it up very nicely in just a few sentences. So, insulate. Next question, how much? And before I talk about how much to insulate, I want to just explain how insulation is quantified. And that's in something called R value. R stands for resistance. How much resistance does an inch of one material compared to an inch of another material offer against heat loss? Here's some common R values of insulation materials used in beehives. Tar paper, 0. Wood, wood chip, sawdust, straw, snow, 1 to 2. Cardboard, fiberglass batting, 3 to 4. And you might be like, oh, our cardboard's a 3 to 4, that's excellent. Well, that would be an inch of cardboard, right? Not just a single ply. And then foam boards, 4 to 5. So talking about insulating hives, I want to just share some research done. This was actually done in University of Illinois a couple of years ago. And what they did, they basically compared insulated hives to non-insulated hives. And they just looked at 3 metrics. The first was colony survival. The insulated hives had a 22.5% improvement in overall survival. They had a twofold reduction in bee population decline. So remember, your bees will die more if they're cold. Yes, it's true. If the colony made it, then they will have far fewer bees coming into spring. And the last thing they looked at was honey consumption. The insulated hives consumed significantly less honey than the non-insulated hives. Another research study looking at quantifying insulation, like how much should we be insulating our hives? This was done by Tom Seeley. As you know, he's a PhD professor of biology at Cornell, very well published, well-known speaker. Back in 76, actually, Seeley and Morse did a research study where they said, you know, bees have evolved for millions of years to survive winters in northern climates. What are the qualities of a natural tree cavity? And they found out, curiously, natural tree cavities are condensing hives. They have sort of an infinite amount of insulation above the enclosure, many feet of wood. The walls are very thick, and they only have entrances at the bottom, no upper entrances in natural tree cavities. In 2022, this time Radcliffe and Seeley took the same research study and took it to a whole nother level. When they studied natural tree enclosures, they wanted to know, what should beekeepers do to make our Langstroth hives much closer to a natural home for a honeybee? And they gave us specific R values of what we should do. They recommended R30 on the ceiling. And just to give you a reference, in Minnesota, new construction for attics recommends R49. So there's, you know, R30 is not that much. And then R10 on the sidewalls. And again, no upper entrances. So now we've got some quantifying numbers on how much they recommend we insulate. Curiously, Etienne Tardif, who's in the Yukon, who gets 90 to 100% winter survival, this is one of his slides, and this is his recommendations. Again, no upper entrances. R30, top of the hive, same as the Seeley study, mentions he uses a condensing wall on purpose, and then R10 to 20 on the sidewalls. So, as I mentioned, the insulation product we developed is data-driven. And so based on the research that we accumulated, we developed design that kind of covers climate zones 1 through 5. Etienne's research in zone 1 to 2, the Seeley research was done in zone 5. Here in Minnesota, we're in zone 3, 4. And so I'm going to next talk about the product itself, but I wanted to sort of give you an idea of the research that informed the design of the product. And I do want to just say that I recognize that this may be a lot of new information, not ventilating and super insulating the top of the hive instead, but I wouldn't want you to just start doing a new practice without knowing the science behind it. So the next part, I'm going to talk about the product itself and some of the research we've done on it. So the product comes in 2 parts, the top insulation panel and then the side wrap. So the top insulation panel is actually made of a product called a vacuum insulation panel. It's the highest R value and the most effective insulation ever made. In fact, an inch is an R46. And remember, foam boards is like 4 to 5, so it's 10 times more efficient than foam boards. The reason for this is in a vacuum, no air molecules exist. And without air molecules, heat transfer or heat loss is greatly slowed down. Think of thermos technology. Thermoses are vacuums. So some brilliant person said, wow, well, why don't we make an actual insulation panel that's a vacuum? And so that's what they did. And this is where my partner came into the picture, is these vacuum insulation panels are very high tech. They're hard to come by. Like, they don't sell them at Home Depot. And so a little bit more about them. Refrigerators who use them have 50% less energy usage, so your refrigerator probably has these in it. Shipping containers can keep cargo at a constant temperature for 5 days. And if not punctured, they have a service life for up to 50 years. Yeti, if you're wondering why Yeti coolers are so superior to other coolers, they use vacuum insulation panels as well. So they're used in many, many industries where you need heavy hitter insulation but don't have a lot of space. And now they've made it to the bee industry. So our panel that we made specifically for the beehive is not an inch. Remember, inch is R46. This is about 3/4 of an inch, so it's an R32, which is what the research recommended for the top of the hive. Not only to keep it above the dew point, but 75% of the heat loss is the top of the hive. So if you're going to insulate like one part of the hive, you should insulate the top. It's custom made to fit exactly over the wooden inner cover. And then of course the outer cover, telescoping cover, goes over that. We also made, and we call it the crown, if you can see the sticker, just because it's shiny and it sits on top of the hive and to honor the queen bee. We also have a conversion kit using a vacuum panel for the Apame hive to make that a condensing hive. And we also have panels that can be used for top bar and lay-ins hives. The panels are obviously very compact, goes without saying. This is 3 vacuum panels to the equivalent of foam board. Mouse and ant proof, and it's eco-friendly. There's nothing toxic that goes in the production of these materials. But I do want to also say that there's nothing magical about these. You don't need these panels to make a condensing hive. In fact, Etienne in the Yukon just gets like an empty hive box and stuffs it full of foam board. This is a beekeeper who was proud to show me his DIY condensing hive, which is wonderful. I had a beekeeper last year email me, all 18 of his hives made it. I think he's in North Dakota, thanking me. And I said, oh, I'm glad you love the product. He said, oh, no, I didn't buy any of your product. I just did what you told us to do in your video. And had excellent outcomes. This person's mom has alpaca. Her plan was to do a condensing hive using alpaca wool. So all you do is super top insulate, don't ventilate, and then less R value on the walls, maybe 1/3 of what you put on the top. So that's it on the top panel. The next is the wrap. So the sidewall wrap is just 1.5 inch off-the-shelf polystyrene foam board. We have 2 densities, so it's depending on the density, it gives an R value 7 or 8. You add the R value of the hive box, brings it up to an 8, 9. Remember, research is recommending 10. And what's nice about our boards is they're water jet professionally cut to fit together like puzzle pieces. So they're easy to assemble, disassemble, stack for storage. We also do have a little hive hugger for the top bar hive wraps, and then these are the crown panels to go on top. Just briefly, I want to talk about choose the right size hive box. Because we only sell a double deep. And people are like, well, why not a triple deep? The research says that you should really match the amount of bees you have to the volume of the hive box. And too few bees and too large a volume will result in winter failure. So I would kind of challenge beekeepers who feel like they need to overwinter in more than a double deep. In fact, this research study was done in Egypt, and it showed that the highest hive temps, the most honey, pollen, and brood were achieved when beekeepers used the smallest internal beehive size. Etienne in the Yukon gets his best overwintering success in single deeps. So kind of, assess how big your colony is in the fall and then overwinter in a hive configuration consistent with the size of your colony. So our own specific research that we've done on the product, this was our first year of data. These are not my colonies. They're a friend of mine who lives in Wisconsin who does cutouts. So again, I'll briefly orient you. Date, temperature in the hive. This time the pink is outside ambient temperature. So what we're looking at here is the two top hives are hive hugger hives. These other colored lines are actually this beekeeper's, the rest of his colonies, but of interest, these are also condensing hives. But because he knows the science, he's been running condensing hives for years. But he's always just put an R10 on top and an R5 on the sidewalls. This is the difference between an R10 and an R30. Remember at the beginning of my talk when I said that that critical temperature difference, less than 60 degrees, metabolic demand high, increased honey consumption versus greater than 60 degrees. Even though they're non-ventilated and they are insulated, the R10 is keeping his hives around 50 degrees. So they're clustering and they're going into that, survival response versus when you bump it up to an R30, this is 75 degrees right here. So they're clearly above 60 degrees where they're not in that stress response. And this beekeeper, he's very techy. So he weighs his colonies in the fall and then again in the spring. And he contacted me in the spring and he said, Peg, hive hugger hives ran not only so much warmer, but they consumed 50% less honey than his insulated hives. And now we know why, right? And he said that when he took the lid off the cover of the hive hugger hives, he said it was like a sauna. All this hot air came rushing out. So based on that preliminary research, and once we got the product developed, I did go back to the University of Minnesota and I said, this is what we've come up with. And they told me about the SARE grant, were kind enough to write a letter of recommendation. And so this research study is a portion of the data where we compared hive hugger with bee cozy, Reflectix, and tar paper. So all of these systems were ventilated hives. And similar broodminder data, these two are hive hugger hives. And these are all the other winterization systems. And they aren't running significantly warmer than the outside ambient temperature, which remember when you ventilate, you have this constant flow of heat loss. So it really makes one curious about how effective insulating is if you're insulating and ventilating. So that's our research. And so in summary, I just want to say that both the scientific literature as well as our own research very much shows that well-insulated condensing winter setups reduce winter mortality, stronger spring colonies, queen starts laying earlier, less honey consumption, and bees have access to much needed water. Here's some of our references if you want to look up some of the research studies on your own. And I do want to share a little bit that we had last year was our first year of sales. We sold about 1,200 units all over the country. This year, the majority of our sales are repeat customers, so that, makes me feel good. If you have any questions, our website's hivehugger.com. This is our email address if you have any questions. So I very much want to thank you for your time and your attention. I appreciate it. I am still working as a nurse. I want to let you know the little boy in the photo at the beginning did have metastatic liver cancer and he beat the odds and he's doing great. So I just want to close with saying life is precious. Take good care of yourself, your loved ones, your bees, and all living things. So again, have a good night and thank you.